So in this section, we're going to talk about automating the Lambda deployment, and then we're going to introduce CodeDeploy. So in the previous section, the way we actually updated our code in the Lambda function was copy and paste code into the console, right? Now we want to do a more traditional approach where we have a repository and we can push changes through code. So that's the big picture. The solution here is sort of more of a homegrown sort of approach. What I mean is that it looks like Amazon got something called their serverless application model called SAM, which is like their preferred way of doing anything to do with Lambdas. We haven't been doing that. We've been doing sort of like just writing the Lambda function directly. So in this section, we're just going to go with using kind of basic approach where we just create a Lambda function, and then we're going to use code commit, code build, code pipeline, and now we're going to introduce code deploy to actually deploy the Lambda, kind of more following the line of what we've been doing so far. And separately, I'm going to, in another section, I'm going to talk about the serverless application model, and you know, I may switch to it or I may not, depending on what I learn. But so that's the big thing there, which means that there's one unusual piece of this, right? Because there's not a lot of good documentation about how to do this outside of serverless application model, right? A whole kind of a deployment cycle for a Lambda function. So what we're going to do here, and we'll look through the solution, is we're going to basically use code commit to hold the code for the Lambda function. We're also going to use code build in this flow to actually do a lot of the deployment, quote unquote deployment, meaning we're going to actually push code in a build script there. And we're actually going to trigger code deploy itself through a script that's in code build. So the pipeline itself will pretty much end at code build. Yeah, unlike other ones we've been doing where the code pipeline actually went kind of end to end, this is going to basically hit code build and then just stop. So there's no deploy step in this code pipeline, even though it does deploy. Okay, so that's the main gist of it. So we're going to just look at the pieces of this. So let me close this down. And again, I'm going to, instead of building it all on the screen, there's just a lot of little pieces. I'm going to try to point them all out. And there's links in the story to all the code, so you can actually follow along in the code too. So the first change I did here was in my Terraform configuration under the Lambda function, the Lambda to-dos create, right, module. I added an alias, and this alias is called development, wherever that is. It's called development. So this is basically the idea here is the development alias is now what we're going to be using as sort of the function that we're actually using for our development code, right? And again, this is not a tutorial on aliases and lambdas, but that's what this extra alias bit is, right? And the other big change here is that I went ahead and changed here, and I actually went in manually into the console and removed the trigger that I had created manually before for the DynamoDB, right? And this time I actually went in and I mapped the trigger, right, using Terraform. So this is basically saying the trigger here now is pointing to whatever this is. It's basically the function name is this, and the event source is this to-do stream ARN, right? So that's basically the trigger right there, and it's triggering on this alias, not on the latest. Okay, so that's a little bit of that was the first piece of this. At that point, you have an alias that's where the trigger is kind of being tied to, and now we start moving into the rest of this. So we'll close this out. Okay. So the first thing we'll need to do is go into the console. When we set up CodeDeploy, which is the first thing we're going to work on, you need to create a role, and there's documentation. The wizard I thought would do it for me, but it didn't. So you actually had to create the role manually. So I'll show you what the role looks like. In this case, I named it should be called CodeDeploy. What did I name it? CodeDeploy Lambda service role. Oh, there it is right there. Okay, so this is a generic role that allows CodeDeploy to do all things Lambda. And the good news is that they actually provide, for most of the policy, they actually provide a built-in policy, right? And it gives you, let's see, where's the summary here? You know, it has lots of details about it, or whatever. I mean, it did this without me doing it, so I didn't have to worry about it, right? So that was all for free. But this CodeDeploy actually also needs to access an S3 bucket as part of its build process. And so in this case, and later on, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. I actually created another bucket. I guess I should look at that in a minute. But I created a bucket called CodeDeploy Lambda To-Dos, and I give this CodeDeploy role, I give it get bucket and list bucket, a get object and list bucket. So basically, you can pick up this, and in this case, I'm actually giving it to this bucket, basically, right? So it can basically pick up files in that bucket. Okay. Okay, there's that. Actually, well, I'm not going to fix it. I just noticed something here. I see that I got an S3 star.star and this. So I need to make a note to myself to fix this, because I'm pretty sure that this is too generous. Fix. Okay, I'm pretty sure this should just have the bucket itself, not all buckets, basically. Somehow that slipped in here. Okay, next thing is CodeDeploy. So let's just walk through kind of the bits and pieces of CodeDeploy. CodeDeploy. Okay, so you'll see it's already created. I don't want to go through recreating this thing. But I'll walk you through the main steps. The first step is you create an application. The application, basically, all it really has is all you really do is you pick what kind of platform it has. In this case, we're doing Lambda. So really, the application just defines the kind of deployment. Is it Lambda, an ECS, or an EC2? So that's the first step. The next part is called, you need to create a deployment group. In this case, I created a deployment called To-Dos Create Publish. And the guts of it, the main point here is you need a couple pieces here, right? The big thing here you really just need to do is assign the service role. And that's the role that we just looked at, right? And then you basically have to tell it the kind of deployment. In this case, it's kind of an auto pick list, but I'd use the Lambda all at once. So it's basically, when this deploys, it's going to switch all the lambdas that are up and running are just going to switch, right? And that's basically all a deployment group is for lambdas. It's basically what role and then how it's going to deploy it. And then later on in code, we're going to create the deployments, which really tell it, okay, what lambda I'm going to do, and kind of, the actual deployment is actually in the deployment itself. Okay, so that's the code deploy piece. Let me go now. So we actually then created code commit. So I'll look at it, I guess. Although it's just a repo, right? So there's now a repo called To-Dos Create Publish. I just created it. I didn't do anything special, right? And then there's also CodeBuild. So for CodeBuild, so basically I just kind of walk you through how I built this, right? So for CodeBuild, which is probably here, build projects, I created a project called To-Dos Create Publish. So basically, all you do with this primarily is you connect it to the repo, right? And then let's see if I can find it. It's down below. Oh, it's not here. Let's see, where is it at? Build projects. Details. I think it's under here. Okay, right. So you basically tie it to the repo, right? And then there's the source, right? And then you tie it to the master branch. You tell it, what kind of machine it's to run. Just like all the other videos, I use the Ubuntu choice, right? And then the only other thing here is we'll see in our code, see if I can find it. Oh, here it is, buried here. One other thing we, in the code we'll look at shortly, right, the build script, we use some environment variables, and so I set up all these environment variables here. And one, you can see them here. Two, when you look at the code, you will see these being referenced, right? So that's where they're being set in the build. Okay. Now the other thing that's tricky here is when you create this build project, it creates a another role. So when this build happens, it uses a role, and it auto creates one for you. But our code uses certain AWS commands that it needs special permissions for. So what you then need to do is you need to go back into IAM before this all gets done, and you need to update some permissions. And I'll just kind of walk you through what those permissions look like and why they're there. So it auto creates a role called AWS CodePipeline. CodeBuild to-dos, right, it creates this one right here. And it automatically builds out this manage policy for you, right? But I added, it looks like 4 additional inline policies to deal with some very specifics about the code that's in that code build, like the build spec YAML. So the first one is, I'll start at the bottom, some of the easier ones. Let me make this bigger so you can see it. So the first policy here is, this one's pretty easy to see. This one basically says allow putting objects, S3 put object, and it puts it into that, oh, right, I mentioned it a couple times. I created an S3 bucket, and again, there's an S3 bucket. I just created it, nothing special. It's called to-dos create publish, no, it's called CodeDeploy Lambda to-dos RS, and this particular code allows putting a very specific object in there. And this is basically for the deploy step. This is creating this build, a deploy configuration for the code will build this file basically, right? So that's one permission it needs. Another permission it needs is, it needs to, edit policy. And if you look at the code, you'll actually see all these being used, right? So that's how you basically figure this out. You look at the code and you say, oh, I need to do these things. So it basically allows updating the function code, publishing a version, and getting the alias on the Lambda function itself. So that's what this one here is. And, okay, so that's another one. Okay. Another policy here, I split these up just to keep them like kind of easier to figure out what's going on. This one, you'll see one of the lines in the code will be CodeDeploy, and it calls create a deployment, right? And it's basically, this is basically referring to the deployment group, to-dos create publish. So it allows you to create, the code will create that deployment for you, right? So you need to allow it, okay? Now what's not obvious is the last policy. I had to add this in just through trial and error. So it looks like when you do the deploy, behind the scenes it needs to do a lot of the list commands. So the way this, I ended up just punting on this one. Let me see if I can edit policy here. If I use the, basically what I did was I said code deploy, and I said just give it code deploy. I checked the list box, which gave me all the list options, and I just said this for all resources. So I kind of kept around in circles and circles on, I guess I could have targeted this. Well, yeah, this became hard to troubleshoot. And so the good news, this is just a read action. So I said, okay, screw it. I'm going to let it do all the list actions on all resources, and it just works. So that was kind of a punt, but not terribly dangerous. Okay, so there's a bit of complexity here. So this was basically allowing, just the big picture again here was, I allowed the code build to create a policy for me with all its usual stuff. And then I manually created 4 inline policies, and I just showed you how I created those in that policy. So now when that code build runs, it can actually do what it needs to do. Okay, and that was probably the hardest part of this whole exercise. I did mention there was an S3 bucket. I guess I should just look at that since I mentioned it. Nothing special. I just literally just created an S3 bucket. The S3 bucket itself is called CodeDeploy Lambda to-dos or us, and excuse me. There's a file here, but I didn't actually create this file. This file is actually created by the script, so you don't have to create this file manually. That the script will create that. So this is basically this file is the handoff between the code build to CodeDeploy, because CodeDeploy will read this file. Okay, so the hard part of all this, after all that, is looking at the actual code, and it's linked in there. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm not going to, I'm going to do my best to just summarize it. So it is in to-dos or us. To-dos create publish, I believe. Code. Okay, let's look through here real quick. Yeah, this is the right file. Let me make this bigger. Okay, so first, guess the function folder has our Lambda function. So that's the good news. That's basically just copy and paste, and we're done with that. Okay, so that's good. Let's look at build spec. Build spec is what CodeBuild uses to figure out what to do, and it basically just runs one command. It runs bash scripts deploy.shell. So that's pretty straightforward. Now the complexity is definitely in this script, and it's it's not super long, but it's long enough. So let's just kind of go through it. The first line, I had to just kind of do some bash learning again. This set x, minus x and minus e. The minus x means echo all the responses. So if you're troubleshooting in the logs, you'll see all the commands being run. Minus e means if it ever has an error in any line, it just stops. It basically stops the script. So it's kind of like an abort, as opposed to trying to keep on going down the commands. The first thing is there's a bunch of AWS commands here, right? And again, AWS. This is basically I'm basically trying to read the alias version, the current version of the alias. We'll look at Lambda here shortly and see what kind of refresh our brain what this is. But this is kind of where the alias is, what version is the alias currently pointing at, and I populate that into an environment variable. And I found a cool library that's built into most Linux distributions called JQ, which is basically a JSON parser, and it's very easy to use. Okay, so this basically puts the alias version in there. It's going to create the zip. It's going to go into that function folder, create a zip out of it, and create a zip file, which is basically the code. Then we basically run another command called AWS Lambda update function code, where we basically take that zip file and we push it up. So now the latest version of the code is now this function, whatever's in that zip file. Okay, and then we parse out of that result whatever version it gets back for the latest version. So now we have where the alias is currently at. We have the latest version, which is what we just published, right, or whatever we just what we just published here, right? If for whatever reason, I want to be safe, if the development version, right, the new version is greater than, so what is it? Let's see, if the development alias version, which is the alias is pointing at, is somehow greater than or equal to the latest version, whatever reason, it should just exit out and not do anything. This probably will never actually happen, but I don't know, it just felt like the right thing to do. So because you're expecting that you're always promoting up to a higher version, right? The alias is moving up versions. The next thing we need to do is, this is basically getting ready to hand off to CodeDeploy. So the first thing we need to do is we need to basically build there's a file called the app spec that CodeDeploy uses, right? And this is the file. Again, you can read up about it. But basically, I'm creating a file that tells it, what function am I using, what's the alias that I'm promoting, and what's the current version of the alias, and what's the future version of the alias. So that's essentially what CodeDeploy needs to deploy a Lambda function. And then I go ahead and copy that file to my S3 bucket. And the last step is to actually create the deployment, which deploys the code What does it do? It basically moves the alias from the old version to the new version, and then you're done, right? So that's probably the bulk of the complexity. So maybe what would be worthwhile seeing is kind of seeing this in action, and then we'll stop with that. Okay. Again, these videos are getting harder and harder to do. It just seems to be getting more complicated, but do my best I can. AWS console. So let's look at the current state of my Lambda function. So if I go to Lambda and I go to my function here, right? And one thing you really got to understand is there's this qualifiers. This kind of tells you what's really going on. So first of all, you can see I've been playing around with this a lot. So I'm up to 10 versions of this thing, right? So this is basically all the versions I've been publishing. And you can see this little tag is the alias, whatever the alias is pointing at is where this will show. You can also see that there's only 2 aliases. One is basically my one I created, and then the built-in one, which is essentially the unqualified URL, right? But we're using development, right? And you notice if I go to development, that's where the trigger's at. So you can see if I click on development, that's where my trigger is. My trigger is not on anything else. Okay, so we're on 10 right now. Oh, you know something? I just realized one thing I didn't talk about was I didn't create the pipeline yet. Yeah, so we'll look at the pipeline, and then we'll do the whole flow, and then we'll be done. Okay, so I forgot to talk about the pipeline. So basically what we're going to do, just so you know in a minute while we're on the screen, we're on 10. We're going to commit some code. We're going to see this go through the process of making a version 11, and then it'll move this alias. The deploy step actually moves the alias from the development alias from 10 to 11, and then it's deployed. Okay, so let's go back and look one last step. What does the pipeline look like? The good news there, the pipeline is pretty much a no-brainer. Code pipeline. The configuration of it is I guess I could hit edit. No, I mean, I'm just going to sketch it out. Basically, there's only 2 steps. There's a source stage and a build stage. And all I really do, just so you know, there's nothing more when you create this, is I basically say, create a new one. I point it, the source step to the master branch of the repository, right? And then I tell it the build stage is the build step. Then I hit save. That's it. I mean, that is really all there is to this. Let's do the last step here, which is demo this all in action here, right? So let's see if I can. What I want to do then is I want to go into my code, make it change, and then see that it flows through. So if I'm going to go to Documents, now mine is in To-Dos, Create, Publish. That's the repo I have, right? And I'm going to come in here. I'm going to go into my code itself, since that's really what I want to edit. And I'm going to edit To-Dos Created, and I'm going to put in here just some different text for video. Okay, so that way it's pretty clear that this was tied to the video, right? So I'll just change the subject of the email that gets sent to say to-do created for video. I commit it, which I'll just do it to the command line. Git add commit minus video git push origin master. Okay, so that's pushing it to the repository. And then what we should see, if I go to the pipeline, it might be hard to watch this. I probably have to pause this, but so let's see. If I go to the pipeline, I should see it starting up, and you can see it, right? It's now basically checking out the source, right? It's going to kick off the build, and we'll start to watch the build. I think we can. Only takes maybe about a minute or so. So, okay, it's in the build step here. Here's the execution ID, so maybe we can see the actual Let's see, in progress, timeline. It's still starting. I'm going to pause the video for a second until the point where we can see the output. So this sometimes takes about a minute or so to spin up this instance. So I'm going to pause the video for a minute. Well, of course, by the time I got to it, it already finished. But so this is, I'm looking at the code build, right? Because this is where all the action was anyway. And if you look at it, you will start to see all my commands running here, right? So that's why I have all these outputs tells me I can see all the AWS commands, and eventually ends up with a deployment. So and it succeeded, right? And then you can go back to CodePipeline if you wanted to see from its perspective. It will give you a green light saying that it overall succeeded because both steps succeeded, right? It got the source code, did the build, right? And then if you want to see that, okay, well, did it actually do anything? You can go to Lambda, and if you look at Lambda, look at the Lambda function, go to this quantifiers, right? A couple things you'll notice. One is the latest version now is 11, right? And deployment is pointing at it. And if I look at the code for version 11, right, I will notice that it should have the created for video right here. So they did deploy it end to end, and it also switched my development alias to point at the new code. So now if I was to go, and I don't want to do it right now, but if I was to go in and create a new to-do, I'll get an email, and it'll say, I'll have the new message in it. Okay, so I think that's it. It's a little bit, I know this was a little bit meandery, but hopefully I hit all the topics that I touched in the code, although it was a bit complex.